Here we go. So, just real quick, today's agenda will kick off with an outlook of Trump's levers on the U.S. energy presented by Mike Human, our industry analyst and founder of Ignition Research, followed by the top 10 grid Trump administration's potential changes in 2025 and beyond, given by Sean Walsh, Chief Marketing Officer at Peak. We will then conclude with one of my favorite parts of our What's Next sessions, where attendees' questions are addressed in a live Q&A session. So please be sure you post your questions as we go through this event. So before we get started, I just want to touch on a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is absolutely being recorded. We will share the link once we conclude with the event in the next 24 hours. We will also share the slides. There's a magnitude of resources and links within this deck today. And yes, we also encourage all of you to share it with your colleagues and others who might be interested. We also ask that you participate in our polls. That's how we learn from you and how we learn what you're interested in for future events. We also invite comments and questions. They will be directed to our panelists in our Q&A session at the end of our event. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions, but know that any of those questions that we don't get to, we will address them personally in an email. Please be sure to post your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen and not in the webinar chat. You can also submit questions anonymously by selecting the anonymous button when submitting that, so we don't know who you are, or leave your name in there. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Sean Walsh, Chief Marketing Officer of Peak. He's going to kind of set the stage for today's event. Mr. Walsh, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Cindy. I wanted to do a couple introductory comments before I hand it off to Mike Human. Like many of the folks that are on this call, we are part of the power grid industry. We make some capacitor films that go into power substations and help with power factoring, all sorts of stuff. So the genesis of this webcast was looking at what are those changes that are going to occur and what do we think will happen based on what we've seen in terms of nominations. If you look at the folks who are being put forth to lead these agencies, their backgrounds are very different than what we see in the current administration, so that's going to be a big piece of it. The second is looking at what we know are the policy sources that the incoming administration has used, and trying to take the combination of that policy work and the technology trends that we see happening in the power grid. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to our favorite prognosticator, Mike Human from Ignition Research. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Let's jump to the first slide here. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the Trump 2.0 administration could potentially do to the power grid trends in the industry in general. And we're going to look at it from a couple different angles. First, we're going to look at what are the levers they have on electricity demand. As I'm sure you all know, electricity demand is going up, not surprisingly, as the world electrifies. For a country like the US that's already electrified, it's really a question of what are new things that weren't electrified before that are now. The other side of it is on the production side. How can we produce more electricity to keep up with the demand? And as we look at the incoming Trump administration, they really have three main levers that they can kind of impact power demand with. The first one is reducing EV tax credits. We'll talk a little bit about that. Obviously, if they have tariffs on China, those could impact EV batteries and batteries for storage systems. And the third one is any tech-focused legislative or regulatory impact on AI. We all know that the Trump administration or Trump previously has made comments that were, I'm not going to say anti-tech, but certainly concerns about the tech industry, big tech as you might call it. AI is just the latest example of that, or a piece of that. What could they do that might have an impact on that? Obviously, also AI is one of the largest growing power consumers in the United States, and so we'll dive into that a little bit. The second one is on electricity production. So they have a few levers they could use here. Obviously, reducing environmental limits on coal plants, speeding up permitting of nuclear and natural gas plants, reopening existing closed plants, whether they're nuclear, gas, or coal. And then finally, what would be the impact of tariffs on China imports? For instance, solar panels, batteries, things like that. So let's talk a little bit about EVs first. If you look at the EV market, obviously cars have went up a lot in price since the pandemic. That's true of all cars, not just EVs. But EVs have always been a little bit price sensitive. If you look at what really drives it, EV procurement or purchases by people, there's two things. There's the federal tax credits. Today, it's a $7,500 tax credit. That's part of the Biden administration Inflation Reduction Act, which is law today, currently applies through 2032. There's also state additional incentives and things like that. Those generally wouldn't be affected by the Trump 2.0 administration. Obviously, eliminating these current tax credits, the federal ones, would require congressional action. It probably would not impact in 2025. Usually anything affecting taxes is pushed by 1 year, so that would be a 2026 and forward impact. But if you look at kind of demand for EVs, a lot of that could be potentially offset if rules are relaxed on driverless cars. Obviously, with Elon Musk being part of the government in whatever role you might say he has, they're looking heavily at fleet sales of Teslas and driverless cars, which obviously Tesla's put a lot of energy into, could help offset those sales. Now, our concern really is what happens on the energy side by all these things. The other one is battery tariffs, right? So we know that there are going to be tariffs. There already are tariffs, I should say, on Chinese EV batteries as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's likely if the Trump administration adds 5% of that, which is the number currently talked about, that's going to make these Chinese batteries more expensive. There are alternatives to Chinese batteries. Germany has started a lot of production. The U.S. has started production as well. Although these may not be able to support the demand for EV batteries that the U.S. has today. Overall, our guess or our forecast is that the sales reduction on EVs will be about 10 to 20%. However, we've got a lot of EVs out there. That means the actual impact on electricity demand is probably very low single digits. Think 1 to 2% at most. Let me jump to the next slide here. So let's talk a little bit about, here we go, AI. So AI is obviously, the power demand is increasing exponentially from AI. If you look at power demand, there's expectations that could be a total of 9% of US electricity consumption by 2030. So that's only 6 years away. Interestingly enough, half this power consumption is in the Metro Washington, D.C. area. In fact, in Virginia right now, 26% of power consumption is for data centers. Obviously, a lot of this is for federal government work. So it's not likely you're going to see things that impact that in the short term. And Virginia is not the only metro center that has problems with power consumption. A lot of the other big metropolitan areas, the Bay Area, New York, other places like that are seeing power consumption where it's pushing very close to the margins. And you're getting to the point where AI power consumption could cause brownouts or things like that potentially. So what can the federal government do? It's actually pretty limited when you think about it. Most regulation of utilities happens at the state level. So they can do some things to increase the actual supply. We'll talk about that a little bit. But right now, the only big thing that they could potentially do is simplify the use of things like SMRs. And we'll talk a little bit about more on that on small nuclear generators. So right now, it's kind of uncertain what their impact could be on this area. Could they put in rules that limited the growth of AI? It's possible. That's probably the biggest one. And I think if you're looking at guys like Elon Musk and others who have invested in that area, the likelihood of that happening is pretty low. Here we go. So I think we missed this. No, that's it. Right. So anyway, so let's look at power production. right? So obviously there's, we can make it easier to permit new plants. There's a lot of regulations that are federal based around plant permitting, especially environmental ones and especially nuclear, which is also regulated by the Atomic Energy Commission. But if you look at the timelines of these plants, to build plants is still measured in handfuls of years to decades. The fastest plants to build, believe it or not, are photovoltaic solar plants. Those take 8 to 18 months, so roughly about a year and a half. Biggest issues there, though, is you can't just build a plant and drop it in the middle of the farmland and then say, okay, we have power. You got to run lines to it. You got to procure the land. And in a lot of areas, there's becoming a lot of popular, you could call it a resentment or popular, fighting of that sort of trend. Especially with battery storage, there's a lot of concerns about fires and things like that. Natural gas plants are a little better. You're looking at 1.5 to 3 years to build them. The big issue there is you got to have the fuel to fill those things up. Now, I know the Trump 2.0 administration is talking about doing more drilling and things like that. That could help on the fuel side. But there's a lot of demand for natural gas today, and that's only going to continue to go up. China is a big consumer of liquefied natural gas. That puts pressure on U.S. prices as well. Coal fire plants, if someone was to build one of these, that's 3 to 4 years. Okay. So that's pretty much near the end of Trump 2.0 by the time one gets built. You have to ask yourself, what sort of utilities would invest in a plant that 4 years from now, if, for instance, the Democrats won, would become, something that would be looked upon negatively and may not even be allowed to go online. Nuclear is kind of the interesting one. Even if you simplify all the regulations, you're still looking at 7 to 8 years to construct and test a nuclear plant. That's forgetting all the permitting. Let's say you get a pass on all that. So you're at least in the start of the next decade before you're going to see any of those come up. One of the interesting wild cards in this whole discussion, though, is what's called small modular reactor nuclear plants, or SMR nuclear plants. There's several of these that have been designed so far. They're not what you typically call something as a primary power source for a large city. They're typically in the 300 to 500 megawatt range of capacity. But for something like a steel mill or a data center, those could be great. Additionally, to augment power needs of large cities, SMRs could work very well. The one negative here is, to date, no SMRs have been deployed in the United States. There are a couple companies that have got licensing on those, but we don't have one yet. So, you're still looking at something that's probably past the end of the Trump administration. So let's talk about another subject that's been discussed quite a bit, and that is reopening existing plants that have been recently closed. The question here really is how many and when. So if you look at nuclear, for instance, there's only three plants that have been discussed being potential recommissioned. There's a plant in Palisades, Michigan, that is actually in the process of being recommissioned. That'll open in 2025. As I'm sure most of you have heard, a lot of people have looked at reopening one of the units at 3 Mile Island. That could be done as well. And there's a plant in Iowa called Duane Arnold. It had some cooling towers that were damaged in a meteorological event. Once those are fixed, it could be reopened as well. That's 3 plants. Every other plant that's out there that's been closed has been at least partially or completely dismantled and decommissioned. So you're not talking about a lot of power there, maybe 2 to 3 gigawatts at best. If you look at natural gas, again, you've got a situation where the plants that have been decommissioned or have been closed, usually it's because they reach the end of their life or they requiring lots of repairs and maintenance, or else they become economically unviable. Same is true on coal. So coal really is one that even the numbers work even more against us. If you look at total coal retirements in the last year, there's only 3 gigawatts of plants retired. If you look across the last 4 years, it's under 10. So if you take all this together, that probably allows you to reopen a capacity somewhere between 20 or 30 gigawatts of power, which is about 160 to 240 billion kilowatt hours of energy. That's less than 1% of our demand today. So that's not really going to help us a lot as far as supplying these big needs that we have. Finally, tariffs on solar panels and batteries. Whether you know it or not, we already have a 20% tariff on imported solar panels from China. That's there today. Same with batteries. Those are really a result of anti-dumping actions taken by the US against China. Those are actually being increased to some other countries in Southeast Asia that it appears that China is using to route these products into the US market. What's the impact been of these tariffs so far? You've seen a slight increase in the cost of solar cells, but because there are so many sources out there, that's been a little muted. The bigger one's probably the slowdown of the deployment of solar generation power storage infrastructure in the United States. That's expected to drop off considerably in the next 3 or 4 years. Obviously, any increases in these tariffs will have an impact. The whole reason you have tariffs really is to try to push a domestic supply chain. But if you look at the time it takes to build a solar cell plant, it's usually 12 to 24 months. Battery plants are about 2 years. There's several new battery plants being worked on today. There's a couple that General Motors is working on with LG, a Korean company. There's another one that LG is working on with Stellantis in Indiana. So these, could come online probably in a year to 2 years. Those, generally speaking, should be good investments for these companies. I don't think those will be affected by tariffs or lack thereof. There's just a lot of demand for batteries today. So let's kind of summarize what we went through, and hopefully, I know I talk fast sometimes, but hopefully you've been able to follow a lot of this. And if you don't, just ask the question in the Q&A piece. If you thought most of these industries are very, very large industries, whether it's batteries, whether it's power utilities, they don't respond well to steering commands, so to speak. These are like, turning a giant oil tanker in the middle of the ocean. You can't make them turn on a dime. So it's going to be hard, no matter what they do in the Trump 2 organization, to have a huge impact on where these things are going. On the other side of it, if you relax environmental regulations of power plants, as we've discussed, it still takes years to build these things. Will they even be online by the end of the Trump administration? And will policies be in place that would make people want to invest in these? Because these are expensive. The average nuclear plant's about $6 billion. So it's a lot of money people are going to have to put in to make these things happen. And then finally, the question becomes around fuel. Natural gas is the obvious alternative other than renewables to provide this power. Today, the demand for natural gas is growing faster than the supply is. It's unclear if new fields could be opened up quickly. If you're a drilling company or an exploration company, you like to explore when the prices of things are high. The price of gas and oil are below, what you typically see is a number that would, tend to spur new exploration and find new fields. Coal obviously is even worse. There are insurance companies that won't even insure coal mines. So opening coal mines to get more coal up, probably not going to happen. So if you kind of look at it all, we talk a lot about the things that are going to happen, but I think in the most part, these are going to be more symbolic than they are material. The expectation that we're going to have huge amounts of free power and cheaper gasoline and things like that probably is a little more symbolic than is realistic. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sean.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. So when we think about what we see as the biggest changes, and I think this is also some of the questions that we're getting towards the panel, is that there is the decision, and then there's the lead time, and then there's whether or not people will take that up. To paraphrase one of Donald Trump's favorite expressions, drill, baby, drill. Well, just because you can drill doesn't mean they will come. The tax credits for doing oil exploration had expired. It's one of the things that the oil industry associations are pushing very hard with the new tax bill coming up. I do think if those tax credits get reinstated and the cost gets deferred, that the combination of the policy changes and the tax credits will definitely increase drilling. Now, one of the things we all know is just because you increase drilling and you increase oil production doesn't necessarily mean that you have the refinery capacity to turn that into things that lower gas prices or that will provide the lower cost fuels for making energy lower cost and giving it the ability to scale. So I think there's a combination here of, while the desire to change the policy I think will occur, and I think we'll see those changes happen, and I think we'll see the tax credits reinstated. As Mike said, that probably won't hit you till 2026. And the other question will be, is that going to change prices? Is that going to change the ability to increase power on the grid? And I don't think the answer to that is yes, because you've got to have places to put it into production. One of the other things that Mike and I spent quite a bit of time looking at was this next chart. Oops. Ah, that one went away. I'll speak to it then. If you look at the Pacific Northwest grid and you look at the New England grid and you look at the UK, they have all shut down the last of their coal-fired plants. Now, we don't have exact numbers on how many would still be operational. But, as Mike said, there's challenges with opening new coal mines. There's challenges with insurance related to it. But if there's anything that could be revitalized quickly, that's certainly one of them, because there just weren't enough nuclear plants built in order to change that scope. The next thing is obviously the rollback of clean energy policies. This has been communicated very heavily that this is something that people in the incoming administration have an interest in doing. I think there's three factors that will stop that. One is that there are PV plants for solar, there's the new battery plants, there's other wind stuff that has started to move back. And no one in Congress wants to take jobs out of their district by repealing existing legislation. So while I don't think we will see the push that we've seen in the future, I don't think we're going to see the DOE loans that we've seen to support the industry over the next 4 years. I think the rollback is probably overstated. Grid expansion. Now, this is something that the current administration has invested in. As Mike said, producing more power plants doesn't matter if you can't get it to the consumer. So I do expect the combination of regulatory changes will make it simpler to do this. I think once you've got those regulatory ways cleared up, you're going to see increased investment to deliver the power that we can generate. And I do expect to see this segment in the market accelerate and do very well. The biggest issue has been not only the cost, but the time to do this. And this is one of the things that I think we can do much more quickly if those barriers to regulatory are removed. And again, I think we'll see significant influxes in cash from the private equity markets in particular to support and fund grid expansion. When we talk about relaxing environmental regulations, now, I don't have any doubt that we're going to see the EPA and other agencies step back from their more aggressive stance. I think the combination of the new Supreme Court rulings on the Chevron case, limiting some of the markets there, are going to create a logjam here. So while I agree the rules will be relaxed, I think that we're going to see a flood of lawsuits on both sides of the equation, either trying to remove previous decisions made by regulatory agencies to free things up, or to see people challenging those who say they don't have to follow it. But I think this is going to be slugged out in the courts for a very long time. I also think this is going to be a case of where your case is heard. The last numbers I saw were that during the Trump administration, he appointed a little over 200 federal judges. The Biden administration is on path to be very close to that. and which jurisdiction you land in will probably dramatically impact whether or not the policy changes can in fact be enacted. Then tariffs. Obviously, this has gotten incredible news coverage, and there are a wide variety of opinions on this subject. I think this is something that can be done to a great extent by executive order, and we're going to see it wielded as a weapon. I also think it is predominantly a negotiation tactic. I think the pattern that we've observed is announce big tariffs, announce the intention to get people to come to the table, then using that as a negotiation point to come up with something that hopefully will be a compromise in the middle. But the one thing that seems to be consistent is that there will be increases in tariffs. That is going to put supply chain challenges in place. It is going to make maintenance of existing systems cost more, and it's going to make construction of new systems cost more because we will not be able to replace overseas manufacturing with domestic manufacturing in the next 4 years. AVs, EVs, and reshoring. Again, tremendous news around this. Goldman Sachs says that AI will probably rise from around data centers because of AI will rise from around 2% of total US power consumption to upwards of 10%. And I do believe that prediction will happen. The companies like Amazon and Google have the capital resources to just go build their own power. And I think they will do that. The second part is, of course, is EVs. While the growth rate of EVs is slowing down, if they take the tax credits away, that's going to hurt its growth rate more. But there's no question that there are more EVs out there. And then the desire for reshoring, it cannot happen if there isn't power on the grid to make these factories work. I can tell you that in our facility in Ohio, we're looking to build a new factory for some of our capacitor films, and power availability is limiting our options in terms of how we do this. So I think the other big trend that we're going to see is this push to build more stuff because of these items. But if we don't do this in advance, you cannot reshore a lot of these domestic parts, which goes back to the challenge of tariffs, increasing overall costs to build the factories that you need in order to enable these strategic objectives. And then this is something that Mike touched on, is while the federal part gets tremendous news coverage, most of the big meaningful decisions are going to be made at the state level. And as we have seen bifurcation in the voting map, we're also seeing bifurcation in the regulatory map. And one of the biggest challenges for larger companies, we see in the auto industry, we see in other industries, is that they have to default to the most strict regulatory parts in order to be able to sell their products both domestically and in international markets. So the EU certainly is not in a position where it is reducing stuff. So as we have large US companies manufacturing things and we're trying to import stuff, what states say will have far more impact on the ability to execute than we have seen in the past. And this may lead to sort of a have and have not sections of the nation. So it's one of the areas that as you're looking at your strategies for your businesses, make sure you pay extra attention to the state level, because I think that's going to rise in prominence in 2025 and beyond. And then there's the Musk factor. Love him or hate him, you can't deny the fact the guy has an impact. And if the DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, has the type of impact that they want it to have, based on what I've read congressionally, I don't think it can, or its desire to change a lot of spending is congressionally required. And given the razor thin margins in the House, that's going to be very, very difficult. I reiterate the point that people that have existing jobs and factories and things in place are not going to want to take the funding away from those in order and reduce jobs. And there is without a doubt, a question about where the private-public line will be drawn. So this will be an interesting dynamic to watch, but you cannot deny the fact that there is a must factor coming into the power grid. He has stated a strong belief in solar. Not a surprise, he has a strong interest in batteries and EVs going forward. So this may mitigate some of the other issues. And again, when we talk about that state level, we've seen in California where some of the EV policies that Governor Newsom are putting in place specifically eliminate or exclude some of Tesla's products. So to paraphrase an old saying, it's a tangled web we weave. And then nuclear renaissance. I think if there's one thing, especially with SMRs, especially with data centers and some of the EV stuff and the need to accelerate delivery of new power for reshoring, this will probably be the most likely answer. They're small, they're modular. The regulatory environment will probably be eased to make it easier for businesses to use these. They have a much smaller footprint than wind or solar energy. And I would never have guessed that I'd be talking about a nuclear renaissance 18 months ago. But I think at this point, all the trend lines point to that being the case. And then one of the other promises of the future is fusion energy. And in full disclosure, Peak is active in the fusion industry. We are proponents of it. That being said, we're seeing early milestones in 27, 28. We have seen regulatory approval. Some of the new changes that have been made by the Advance Act take it out of the nuclear reactor classifications and put it in the particle accelerator type classifications. So that helps. We've seen the state of Massachusetts approve Commonwealth Fusion for moving forward with their Spark system that they plan on turning on in 2027. We've seen the state of Washington approve Helion Energy for their first power plant that's supposed to go online in 2028 to power Microsoft data centers. So we do see material progress in this area, but there is still a long way to go. I am hoping that by the time we look out the next 5-6 years, that we do see active fusion energy contributing to the grid. So with that, Cindy, let me turn it over to you and we'll take some questions.
Absolutely. We have quite a few in the queue, and I'm going to go through them in the order that they came in. So first, our first inquiry comes from Laura Hart. Would it be feasible to portion out AI computing in response to electricity demand and use it to our advantage? Ramp up AI when demand is otherwise low and make production/distribution more predictable.
So I think the answer to that is yes, and I'll let Mike correct me if I go astray here. But the data centers that people tend to use for AI, because of the fact that they are based predominantly on NVIDIA technology, it's pretty easy to actually segment those even in shared locations. So when we think about data centers, there's 3 big buckets. There are the AI data centers, there are the cloud data centers, and then there are the co-location data centers. And I do think it would be reasonably easy to segment those workloads. I don't know that consumers would like that because people are using AI 24/7. The second part to that is that using the AI tools themselves should enable us to help get better efficiency out of it. And again, under general technology trends, little things like, moving to high frequency switching. So we have better allocation of power allocation in power markets. That could add upwards of 10% more or more efficiency in how we're delivering energy that's generated versus over allocating it. So I do think there's multiple dynamics in which AI, both from a consumption perspective and from an efficiency creation perspective, can help the power grid going forward.
Funny, I was actually going to say no, but for all the same things you said. So no, I think Sean's analysis is spot on. If you look at the cloud market as an example, right? What you see there is that if you really want to get a good deal on cloud computing, you have to use it in the off hours, in the off peak times. There's things called on-demand charges that you get hit with, and then there's also charges that get reduced when you're using things when, guess what? No one else is using it, right? So, just like, anybody else in the utility grid, these guys got to pay the same price as we do, to operate. So forgetting whether they put their own power plants in place, which I believe 100% they absolutely will. That's the only way that these things are going to get resolved. But I think you're going to see, this, at least for large corporations, this demand gets spread out. Consumers, and we're talking about, people like us, I don't think we would like it if we had to say, hey, you can put in your request and you don't get the answer till midnight, right? That's kind of giving your competitors an opportunity to do better than you. On the other hand, I don't think we're the ones using lots of power from AI, questions and things like that. I think it's mostly business are going to be the guys driving this. So I absolutely do think it can work. I think you'll see pricing structures that actually make people want to do it that way. And as Sean said, there's a lot of people that think that the correct use of AI, not that necessarily utilities know how to correctly use new technology. They've fallen on their swords a couple times before on that. But if it is used well, it can certainly help stabilize the power grid and help improve operations.
And I'm going to add one more comment to that, because one of the things that Mike and I have also in prior lives worked in the IT business, and there is actually a whole arbitrage market where if I have X number of CPUs reserved under my name at AWS or GCP or Azure, that if I'm not using them, the contracts actually give those cloud providers the right to sell that unused CPU memory and storage capabilities on an ad hoc basis. And then there's a whole sub-industry that just moves workloads around the cloud based on where the cheapest arbitrage capability is. And much like they do in power markets for finding the lowest cost power to serve the market, that's another reason why I believe that we can use AI for those tools, because they're being used for workloads today in that exact same arena. Cindy?
Yes, thank you both. And I just want to share that's over 60 years of IT experience from both these gentlemen. So thank you both for that answer. Our next
Yeah,
question.
I'm old.
You're aging us now. Yeah, thanks.
I said combined. All right, our next question comes from Bruce Rosenthal. For PV and BESS, which are inverter-based resources, what are your views on the current backlog of generation interconnect approvals across all the RTO/ISOs, especially in terms of execution and completion of complex grid stability and system impact studies, primarily electromagnetic transient simulations?
Okay, I think Cindy gets an award for just being able to read that one, because that's a mouthful of words there. So obviously, Bruce, you know a lot about the situation. I'm sure you're also aware of, some of the issues we've had with PV systems. Hawaii had some very public outages about 10 to 12 years ago before they changed the interconnect systems. I think what you really start to see here, though, is you're starting to see a lot of people using PV, BESS, which is battery electric storage systems, and other technologies like that behind the meter. And what we mean by that, and this is also true of load balancing systems as well for power load. if you look at the utilities, right, and I live in California where we have time of day metering, and I also have solar cells as well, you know, you get a lot, charge a lot during peak hours, which are 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. Guess what? You can't produce electricity, solar electricity during that time, which is a lot of reason people have BESSs. What we're seeing now is a lot of businesses actually coming in saying, okay, I'm going to do solar, but I want to have it so that my battery system powers me first. All that happens behind the meter. So the utility doesn't see whether I'm running off batteries. They don't see if I'm running off my PV solar cells. All they see is a net demand one way or another. I think that will simplify the interconnect approvals that are out there. I think though your point is a valid point. As renewables become a greater part of the grid, if there's not battery backing those things so they can produce 24/7, you're going to see more grid instability issues. We're already seeing that. Like I said, Hawaii saw them. We've seen them in other parts of the country as well. That's not true just of solar. It's also true of wind power as well. So in general, renewables do have a problem as far as potentially destabilizing the grid. Batteries help that. But like I say, there's a lot of resistance to batteries being put in areas. Where I live, and I'm under SDG&E in the San Diego area, just to be completely transparent, there have been 2 large battery facility fires in the past 6 months. And there's now a lot of resistance to people putting new battery farms. Because guess what? When these lithium batteries catch on fire, they just burn. There's nothing you can do to put them out. So obviously, we'll have to come up with some better solutions. That maybe it's different battery chemistries or other than lithium ion, but that's certainly an issue that needs to be worked on.
Yeah, I reside in Colorado, and needless to say, we do not have ample water in our state, and that has been one of the biggest concerns, even in my local community. They were attempting to get a new solar farm approved, and if you've ever driven up Highway 25 in Colorado, on the west-hand side, you have the Front Range, which is heavily populated. On the east side, it's about 800 miles of nothing until you hit Kansas City. And that's where they wanted to build it. But again, it's so arid that the concern about fires has halted a lot of that progression. Cindy, I think there was a second part about the that we didn't touch on yet, Mike.
Oh yeah, the peaker plants question. Yeah, I think peaker plants have always been a part of this. I think they'll continue to be a part of it. Again, where I live in San Diego County, I'm actually in the back country, so to speak, where fire concerns are big. They actually paid people to put generators in. So when SDG&E shuts off the power because of wind concerns, my generator kicks in. I think you're going to see generators become more popular for a whole lot of reasons. Fire is certainly one of them, but I think to help stabilize the grid in peak times is also another big part of that. I absolutely think that'll happen. In a sense, I think you're going to see a lot of SMRs be used by cities essentially as peaker plants. I think that will probably be part of the use case for those.
I have another, thank you. I want to bring this one in from Nashum Sadan, and he's asking if you can comment on wind and offshore wind.
That's a really good question. So the history of wind in the US has been kind of up and down. I'm sitting in Austin, Texas right now. Believe it or not, Texas is one of the biggest wind power producers in the United States. Would have never guessed that would be the case. But they are. If you've got the wind and you can put nobody cares about having the windmills out there, it's a great solution. Obviously, we have them in California as well. The biggest issue with wind, I think, has been, and it's true of solar as well, is where are these wind turbines built? Today, 2/3 of them are built in China, and that's a problem from a standpoint of energy independence. Offshore, I'm going to be honest, I'm not certain where that's going to go. Just like you've seen a lot of resistance to offshore oil drilling, I don't think it'd be surprising to see resistance to offshore wind plants as well. They certainly, if you're a big tourist area, they're not exactly the sort of thing you want people looking out from the beach and seeing, a mile offshore. It doesn't look particularly pretty. Probably better than an oil well, but not much better. So
Yeah, I would look at it from two perspectives. The incoming administration has been pretty candid that wind is not on their list of things that they want to invest in. Um, and then the second part is that it's so geographically or it's geographically centric. There are places where you have the ability to do it, and places where you don't. So I don't see it being as big a part of our strategy over the next 5 years, given some of the statements from the incoming administration and the policy organizations that they seem to be following. Which is interesting because if you look at the UK, you look at a lot of the EU, you look at other parts of the world, even in Saudi Arabia, where you would say, okay, they have all the fossil fuels you could possibly want. They're using wind and solar for their domestic power energy. They just put a new 1 gigawatt solar system in place. We've seen them do the same thing with wind energy. So I think it will grow internationally substantially more than it is likely to grow domestically.
yeah, I think one other thing to throw in there, wind also has the issue. We talked about renewables having issues that require power storage. Now, for solar, that's mostly time of day sorts of issues, day versus night. Wind, it's actually seasonal as well. And the longer you store power for, the more you lose, right? So if you look at how you store long-term power, things like pump hydro or geothermal, things like that, they're very lossy technologies. Even today, they're probably 20 to 30% loss over a reasonable period of time. So that's one of the issues solar kind of has to deal with. Can you use it as an addition to existing power? Sure. Is it probably something to to support your baseline requirements? A little tougher.
Yep.
There's no simple answer, right?
Never is.
All right, our next inquiry comes from Dimple Hagley, who thanks us for doing this and wanted to understand from your opinion what the top 3 trends for US investments are and how they will be affected.
Mike, you
I
want to
assume you're talking about, go ahead, Sean.
No, as I say, Mike, why don't you take that one? You're a little closer to that side than I am.
Yeah, assuming you're talking about power investments, I think anything to, smarten the grid is probably a good investment. We're all familiar with the Texas power grid issue that they had several years ago. California runs pretty good today. It's not to say it always did. There was this power situation in the late 2000s that ended up costing a governor his job. That was not that dissimilar to the Texas situation. It was more price-based than it was power availability. But I think you're going to see more interconnecting of these grids. And the question is, how will the Trump administration play into that? But I think, besides smart grid, I think the next one's probably fusion. Fusion is probably one of the few technologies that can actually drive power when we need it, where we need it. It's pretty clean. On an incremental basis, it's cheap. The plants are not cheap, but the incremental power put out is. And the other one's probably nuclear. Again, as Sean said, I would not have guessed. If you asked me 20 years ago, is nuclear on its way up? I'd say yes. And then you had Fukushima, and then it became a big no for quite a long time, right? Just like it did after 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. The nuclear industry is one where you either have big success or big failures. Failures tend to get remembered a lot more than successes. But assuming that we, apply some of the lessons learned we've had, I think that's also a place where you see a lot of investment also.
Yeah, I think I would add a fourth trend to that, which is natural gas. I don't think that we'll see the revival of coal to the level that we've seen. Do I think we will see retrofit of gas to be the water boiling to revive those plants to get stuff sooner? That I do believe. And I believe that new permitting for natural gas plants will be highly accelerated. We also know that the incoming administration is very supportive of liquid natural gas permitting and pipelines. So I think the combination of the scaling demand, that relatively clean source, it's relatively straightforward in terms of how to implement. And if you take the regulatory stuff out of the way, to Mike's chart, it's, for directly dispatchable energy, it's probably the sweet spot.
All right, another one from Jim Dodenhoff. Given Aramco's huge market share in the oil and gas production market, how much impact will incremental increase of U.S. and gas production have on the U.S. oil and gas demand and price market?
You want to jump on that hand grenade, Sean? Or you want me to?
I'll take the first pass. So right now, I'm going to break the answer into three big buckets. So far we've seen OPEC plus shrink production and indicate that they were even considering shrinking production a second time. And the reason they're doing that, in my opinion, has more to do with the drop in demand from China than it does anything else. We've seen fossil fuel consumption also shrink in Japan and in Korea, which are also, relatively large markets. And we're seeing the green push continue in the EU. So I think that those combinations will have a bit of a dampening effect on pricing overall in the market. The second big bucket in this is U.S. production. I do believe that with the current sanctions against Russia and the ability for the U.S. to provide that to the EU, that we'll see that area grow substantially. There's a market for it, there's a demand for it, and there's a geopolitical strategic risk for buying it from us versus Russia. So, that's kind of the third big bucket. Or second big bucket. The third is, what does increase in production mean? And, at the Paris Client Summit, the CEO of Exxon said, just because I can drill more doesn't mean it's profitable to drill more. And there's a reason that they pick $70 a barrel as kind of that pain point price for a lot of the Russia sanctions. So unless we start to see the price of oil rise, and then the secondary part of all of this is, unless we see refinery capability rise, I don't know that we're going to have the right consumption model for all of the reasons that people want. And I don't know that that's going to materially change gas prices, because my opinion, and Mike can correct me if I'm astray here, that refinery production capabilities has far more to do with gas prices than the absolute price of oil. Well, the absolute price of oil will drive spikes in fear, in terms of long-term trajectory. I think the other piece to this for the power and the transportation industry is going to be the reduction in regulations to support new refinery builds, and those have a 5 or 6 year lifetime as well. So I think the combination of those things keep the U.S. oil production relatively muted, even though it'll be more available. But I think you're going to see gas spike. So I'll pause there and let Mike answer.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. It kind of ties in a question. Another question was in the Q&A window, which is, if you look at the impact of tariffs, one of the ones that's been talked a lot about is what happens with Canadian oil. If we get a 20% tariff on Canadian oil, that's primarily going to affect the Midwest. And, that's where most of those refineries get their oil from. So I agree with Sean. I don't think there's a lot at the global level that's going to change. I think regionally you're going to see areas that are going to suffer more from it than others.
Okay, thank you both. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here from Jim Dodenhoff. The major data center operators have huge access to capital and cash and an enormous need for new power. Might they consider entering directly into the power business inclusive of generation and transmission, thereby becoming quasi-competitors of electric utilities?
I'm gonna say yes and no, okay? Will they build their own power plants as part of their data centers? Yes. Will they want to export that onto the grid? I wouldn't want to if I was them, simply because the amount of regulation you get into at that point becomes pretty painful. And now you're fighting a utility who might own the transmission lines and doesn't necessarily want you competing with them. You know, if you look at places where, you know, rooftop solar is big, California being one of them, utilities have gone out of their way to make it difficult to sell power back onto those, you know, as compared to what it was 15 or 20 years ago. I'm sure, regardless of the amount of data center capital, cash, and political capital they have, they're going to have a hard time pushing a utility to take power from them unless there's a real shortage of power to start out with, in which case they generally build power plants.
Yeah, I think they're going to do what you asked, but in a different way. I think what we're going to find is that because of the incredible capital reserves that Google, Microsoft, Amazon, all these major tech companies have, Facebook is another one, that, or I guess I should call them Meta, that what we're going to see is these guys will provide the cash to these folks to build the power plants. They'll get a sweetheart deal and priority usage of the power, and then they'll tell the communities that are authorizing them to build these things, hey, look what good citizens we are. We're adding to your power grid so you can create more factories and other stuff.
And jobs.
I think their strategy is going to be slightly different, but they will put up the money because the money's almost irrelevant to them. It's getting the data centers online that drives their revenues.
And they are power plant operators. So, you know, I don't know, that's a new field they want to learn.
Yeah, I think to Mike's point, they don't want to operate, they don't want to deal with the regulatory, but they can provide the capital to make sure that those businesses have the ability to do it. If I was a business development person for a power company, I would be courting these guys to say, hey, if you put up the money, here's how we'll do it.
Okay, brings me to another question from Kareem Zybat. Do you think local companies are ready to deliver all the components to ensure the upgrade of the grid, as Trump will limit import of foreign components?
Very good question.
So
I
the simple answer is no. There is not enough manufacturing of many of the core power systems in the US. We outsourced it. Right, wrong, or indifferent, we made over the last 25 years, we have outsourced manufacturing, not just in the US, across the globe, to China. They made it very lucrative and reasonable to make those types of business decisions. As we're seeing that transition and desire to not be as dependent, I think we will address it. But, you know, again, from the intent to the decision to the policy to the capitalization to building factories to having replacement parts, that's a decade-long journey. I do think that we will see carve-outs of tariffs and other things to enable the power grid to grow, because if you don't enable that, then you can't ever have reshoring of manufacturing. So I think that we'll live with the short-term pain and inconvenience of that to have the long-term strategic benefit, or at least I hope we do.
agreed 100%. It's a real chicken and egg problem. If you don't have the power, you know, powering the plants is real difficult to do. So
We are past our time, unfortunately. Sean, Mike, thank you both so much for those insights.
no
Our
problem.
pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
I also want to thank our audience for participating in the poll. Also know that we invite you to join us at the next What's Next event. Please email us at what'snext@peaknano.com. We would love to hear from you or have you join as a special guest. Our next What's Next event is going to be on January 19th. I think we touched a little bit on that today. The jobs that will be generated from the incoming fusion environment. Please join us anywhere, wherever your social is. Here are our handles. We thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on January 19th or in 2026. Know that all of these recordings are available on peaknano.com. Have a wonderful holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you.